My lady, good morning. I hope you can see and hear me all right.
I can, Ms Carey. Good morning.
Thank you. This morning we're going to deal with two witnesses dealing with the impact of the pandemic on healthcare and the provision for children and young people. And can I ask, please, that Mr Duncan Burton is sworn?
Repeat after me, please. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare
And affirm.
That
the evidence I shall give.
Shall
be the truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Mr Burton, good morning.
Good morning.
Your full name, please.
Duncan Alastair Burton.
You have, on behalf of NHS England, provided the inquiry with a very comprehensive, over 250-page statement on behalf of NHS England. And I think you are here this morning in your capacity as the Chief Nursing Officer for NHSE, as I'll call it for short.
That's correct.
I think you set out that you've been a nurse since September 1998, held a number of positions since then, and indeed are a member of the Royal College of Nursing.
That's correct.
You, during the pandemic, from September 2019 to April 2021, were the regional chief nurse for the southeast of England. And I think since July 2024, you've been the chief nursing officer for England, taking over from Dame Ruth May.
That's correct, yeah.
All right. I would just like briefly to ask you, please, to explain the role of the Chief Nursing Officer, particularly with emphasis on how it relates to children and young people.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Chief Nursing Officer for England has several different roles, one of which is the most senior advisor on nursing and midwifery matters to government and the Department of Health and Social Care. And also then, as an executive member of NHS England, have a range of responsibilities across a number of different portfolios. For example, particularly relevant to children and young people is the executive lead for children and young people, the Children and Young People's Transformation Programme, maternity and neonatal care.
Right. Can I ask you about that? Because you say in your statement that you hold the executive responsibility for children and young people. What does that actually mean in practice, Mr Burton?
Yeah. So as executive lead, I'm not responsible for every element of children's care throughout NHS England. So, for example, mental health care for children and young people would be the responsibility of the executive that's responsible for mental health. But as within my role, I have a number of different responsibilities for children. So the Children and Young People's Transformation Programme, which is very much focused on making improvements for care for children. So, for example, around epilepsy or asthma, or the rollout of the National Early Warning Scoring System for identifying critically ill children at risk of deterioration. The other thing then I'm responsible for is actually the Children and Young People's Transformation Board, which brings together across NHS England all of the kind of elements that people are working on in relation to children and young people, be that through kind of the Learning Disabilities Programme or the Mental Health Programme. We've also got representation there from the Department for Education, Department of Health and Social Care, and partners such as the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health. So one of my key roles is actually about how do we give voice for children and young people and make sure that the voice of children and young people is really strong in the work that we do. And one of the great things in that transformation board is we have young people who are members of that, supported by a youth forum. And that continued throughout the pandemic as well.
That's what I was going to ask you. Okay. And if I may interrupt you, Mr Burton, obviously you've got a very wide remit, a number of which doesn't cover the impact necessarily of or not necessarily the direct impact of the pandemic on children, but I would like to focus your answers, please, on pandemic issues, whether they pre-pandemic, during, or indeed post-pandemic. Just help us then with the young people on the board during the pandemic. Did they meet often? What kind of input did they have? Can you give us some examples of how they actually positively made a difference to NHSE's response?
Absolutely. So, first of all, I'll just say how grateful I am to the young people that contributed and continued throughout the pandemic to help give their voice to how things were. So one of the reflections from the team, particularly about the work that they did, was feeding actually how it was feeling for them at the time. And we made sure that we tailored the way in which they interacted, so it was online, made sure we had that wraparound support for them to continue to participate in the work that we were doing. But that also enabled us and the team to be able to understand what we might need to be focused on in the pandemic and our response to that. So they met the Young People's Transformation Programme Board met frequently. I think met on the 2nd of April, so right in the middle of 2020 in the pandemic, and looked at a number of the areas around the impacts of the pandemic in the here and now and potentially in the future for children and young people.
Did that include not only the mental health impact, but impact on actual medical conditions, or was it more focused on the mental health impact?
It was all of the impacts that were taking place at that time.
All right. We may touch on the engagement with children and young people as we go through your evidence this morning, Mr. Burton, but can I take you back, please, to March 2020? And I'd like to examine with you some of the decisions taken to free up capacity for COVID-19 patients, primarily to free up capacity for adult patients, but look at the impact of that on the provision of healthcare on children and young people. And I think, as you told us, you at the time were the regional chief nurse for South East England, so not exactly a small region. And can we go, please, to your paragraph 252 and the 16th of March 2020, where NHSE published its first iteration of the clinical guide for the management of paediatric patients during the coronavirus pandemic.
Yeah.
And just to help your ladyship, the next day came out the phase 1 letter, which essentially was designed to free up a number, thousands of beds by the cessation of elective care, by increasing private healthcare capacity and expediting discharges, with which I know your ladyship will be familiar. But that's where we are in the timeline. And we can see there that NHS England advised paediatric services to keep children out of the healthcare system unless essential, use telemedicine, do you mean remote?
Yes.
Remote appointments and the like for non-direct care, and plan for stopping elective procedures and treatments, especially those that may consume critical care and ward resources. Now, can I ask you about that last sub-paragraph? Because people might be wondering is why you were potentially stopping elective procedures that might consume critical care, because it might suggest that the treatment was urgently needed, albeit that it also might have a significant impact on the child or young person. Why was that part of NHS England's advice to paediatricians?
So I think if you go back to the period of time in March 2020 and we were faced with an overwhelmingly significant risk of a huge amount of critical care capacity being needed for dealing with COVID-19, which was unprecedented. Clearly, we had to respond to that. And I think what this shows is particularly we were thinking about all parts of the system and actually how it could all contribute to that significant effort of caring for people with COVID-19. I think if you look later at the phase 1 letter on the next day, I mean, clearly there is at no point do we stop or suggest we should stop anything that was urgent, that wasn't COVID-19, but we also knew at this point in time that the risk to children, it was emerging that the risk to children of COVID-19 was, in comparison to adults, less on critical care resources and impact. That is not in any way to lessen the impact that it did have on some children, and sadly some children did lose their lives to COVID-19, and I don't want to lessen that impact at all. But comparatively to adults, it was different. So we therefore, needed to make sure that we were freeing up resource to be able to have sufficient critical care capacity, and some of that included the response from our paediatric colleagues in places such as paediatric intensive care.
Right. I think also that the letter set out the possibility for redeployment of students, newly qualified, and even some junior paediatric staff to adult services. So that brings us on to that phase 1 letter. And as we know, it was considered vital to free up, I think it's between up to 30,000 beds across a number of measures taken during that month. But in particular, by pausing non-urgent services, it was hoped that that could free up 12 to 15,000 beds by that measure alone. And just can I ask you about the letter that was sent out to all the trusts and the various other organisations involved? Do you agree, Mr. Burton, that there was no specific reference in that 17th of March letter to children and young people explicitly?
There wasn't a specific, it was all age.
Right.
And obviously we'd issued the guidance the day before on the, which you've just displayed on the screen.
Right. But I take it that by pausing elective care, or planned care to call it another phrase, that implicitly included services for children and young people.
Absolutely.
And you say in your statement that in England, patients, including children and young people, should not normally wait longer than 18 weeks to start elective treatment once they've been referred by a consultant. Is that right?
That's correct.
So does it follow that it was obvious that in pausing elective care, it was likely that 18-week target was not going to be met in a large number of cases, whether adult or children and young people?
I absolutely think that's right, yeah.
Right. As at the 17th of March, can you help? Was there any idea about when elective treatment may be able to resume, or was it not possible to say? As at the 16th, 17th?
I think on the 16th and 17th, and if I go back to my time as the regional chief nurse there, we were in the midst of dealing with, at pace, a significant challenge around how do we make sure that there's sufficient critical care capacity for the wave of COVID that was coming. And therefore, I think whilst we continue to make sure and be very clear in our communications about the need for the most urgent of elective cases or emergency cases to continue, we had to focus our energy and effort on that. So at that point in time, I think it's fair to say we were very much in the midst of focusing on that.
So there was, for the reasons you've set out, no ability to say, well, we're going to be able to start it 4, 6, 8, 12 weeks. But was there, in fact, a plan, as at the 17th of March or thereabouts, for how resumption would start, even if you didn't know when?
I'm not sure I'm able to answer. I don't believe that there was a specific plan, although what I would say as part of any of our EPRR processes, there are, so our emergency response processes is always a look about how do we do recovery. But at that point in time, and my recollection of that point in time, particularly kind of if I was a member of the gold leadership team in the region as the regional chief nurse, we were very much focused on the here and now because that's what all of the energy and time needed to be on.
There was, however, a plan a few weeks later that was announced in the Phase 2 letter on the 29th of April of 2020. And it was a plan to really establish how NHS England was going to operate now that patient numbers were beginning to fall, although it was clear that COVID was not going away. Can I ask you, please, about some aspects of the Phase 2 letter? And could we have on screen INQ 40087412? And there's the letter on the 29th of April. And page 5, please. And if we look at the top of the page, the letter from Sir Simon Stevens, as he now is, and indeed Amanda Pritchard, made it clear to the recipients of the letter that over the next 6 weeks and beyond, we have the opportunity to begin to release and redeploy some of the treatment capacity. And it means we're now asking all NHS local systems and organisations working with regional colleagues to step up non-COVID urgent services as soon as possible. And they also ask that within the regional teams, for those teams to make judgments on whether you have further capacity for at least some routine non-urgent elective care. And attached to the Phase 2 letter was an annex which did in fact make reference to some children and young people's services. And if we look, for example, at page 7 of the annex, We can see there a particular reference to maternity care, both antenatal and postnatal care, looking both obviously to reassure the women but also to care for the babies that have arrived. And if we go on, please, to page 8, there is reference there to, forgive me, community services, and the bottom bullet point, essential community health services must continue to be provided, with other services phased back wherever local capacity is available. Prioritise home visits where there is a child safeguarding concern. Now, may I ask you about that? Clearly there was, on the 17th of March, the advice to stop community health services, which would have had an impact on safeguarding concerns. But do you know, Mr. Burton, did all home visits where there was a safeguarding concern stop, or was it able to have some between 17th of March and now the end of April?
Yeah. So I think just in terms of this letter, sorry, did you say the 17th of March?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think on the 17th of March, clearly there was the letter that had gone out. On the 19th of March, there was guidance that was additional guidance that was sent out in relation to community health services, which set out actually a table which I think is part of the evidence pack.
Well, if you want to go to it
Yeah.
now to help you, let me slot it in now. And could we have up on screen, please, INQ 4049706, which I think might help you, Mr. Burton, with the position in relation to community health services. So let's just backtrack slightly so it's clear in the timeline. 17th of March, the exhortation to suspend all elective, non-urgent services, including community health services. But a few days later, within community health services, there was a letter that was sent out prioritising some community health services. And if we go, please, to page 2, I hope we will have there we are, the guidance that accompanied it about what should be stopped, what should be partially stopped, forgive me, and what should continue. And we can see there in red, there was a decision taken to stop National Child Measurement Programme, audiology, and the Friends and Family test. What was the rationale or the basis for deciding what to stop, what to partially stop, and what to continue?
Yeah. So I think if we just go back to the letter of the 17th, that was clearly went to everybody, set a very clear what the health service needed to do to respond to the pandemic immediately. Clearly, this subsequent guidance was around clarifying and making sure it was clear for community health services and supporting that local decision-making around what areas could be stopped, what areas needed to be kind of managed on a risk basis. And you'll see as you go through this document, not everything was stopped. Some of this was suggested about what could go on to online, for example, what needed to continue, particularly if you look at some of the services around those most vulnerable children, looked after children, safeguarding, for example. So this was really to help and support those community services with understanding what that stop of non-urgent work needed to be.
All right, so we can see there where they stopped some programmes, presumably, although preferable for them to continue, it wasn't sort of clinically necessary to continue the National Child Measurement Programme, audiology, and the Friends and Family test. That we can see vision screening, a partial stop, say for newborns, and the 6 weeks check. And if we just go to page 2, you can see then there is a various stops, but with the exceptions column.
Yeah.
The pre-birth, school nursing, community paediatric service was continued. And if we go on, please, to page 5, in the continue section, safeguarding is said to continue. Do you know whether that was done in person, online, or how it was envisaged that safeguarding community health services would continue for children and young people?
Yes, and if I can just go to the safeguarding section of my statement, if that is okay. Let me just find that. I think the thing to just to reflect on as well is that at this point in time, if you remember about the 17th, we were also dealing with a new virus where we were trying to make sure that we were protecting staff as well as patients in some of this decision making. In terms of safeguarding, NHS England's responsibilities for safeguarding did not change throughout the pandemic, and in fact, what our safeguarding teams did was to make sure that we pivoted or made sure that we kind of reacted to the needs of children and young people in terms of safeguarding. So, for example, one of the things that was coming out very early around this period was that there were a number of looked after children that were having to relocate around the country. So, you know, we asked for a COPI notice to make sure that we were able to share information and data with other parts of the system to make sure we were responding to what we were seeing in terms of safeguarding needs. But, you know, our responsibilities as professionals didn't change during this period of time for safeguarding.
Right. Your responsibilities may not have changed, but do you know if actual safeguarding visits took place in person, or did they move to online, or was there a hybrid system? Do you know the position?
So I think in terms of safeguarding, when we say safeguarding visits, there are a number of different professionals that every professional has a responsibility around safeguarding. Clearly, there are professionals that have responsibility all responsible for safeguarding, but some have responsibility for identifying needs, etc. So, for example, health visitors during this period, and you'll see in this document, for example, health visiting, there was suggestions about some of that moving online, some of that stopping, and some of it very much focused on those children most at risk. So I think it's fair to say safeguarding activity didn't stop, but safeguarding activity had to change to keep up with this. So, for example, you know, as testing centres came on, we made sure that the staff in testing centres were trained around safeguarding and what the things they might need to look for and spot in some of these areas. And then we also, as more clinical contacts happened online, we needed to make sure that the kind of guidance around online factored in the safeguarding needs of children.
Were you, in relation to these decisions that we've been looking at, either to stop, continue, or somewhere in the middle ground, do you know whether the basis for deciding what to stop and what to continue was taken from a health perspective, a cost perspective, a staff redeployment perspective, all of those things and others? Do you know what the basis was for these decisions? Well,
I think I would put cost to one side. I don't think cost ever at this point in time entered into certainly into the conversations I was in, or any of the decision making in terms of that was made at NHS England. I think the decision making that was taking place at that time. Actually, could you repeat the question, please? Well, it was really, was it taken on the basis of clinical need, or was it taken, we'll stop that, because actually that would free up 100 staff? Yeah. So it was based on all of those factors. So essentially we had to provide staff to staff critical care services, that wave of the pandemic. So we needed to free up staff. We also needed to protect staff. So actually we wanted to make sure that and patients, we wanted to make sure that the contacts that needed to be had were the most essential contacts, but also thinking about the needs of most vulnerable children. We're going to look at some of the impacts on children in a moment. But just to deal with the final phase 3 letter, so there was a plan for some resumption by the end of April 2020, and then come the 31st of July 2020, NHS England set out the priorities for the remainder of that year, and specifically stated that the focus was on returning to what they called near normal levels for non-COVID health services, and to try and maintain routine elective surgery and prepare for wave 2 and or the winter. And we know there were a number of targets set. There's just one aspect of the phase 3 I'd like to ask you about, please. And could I have on screen INQ 405147? And it's referenced to, in the letter, page 6, please, to expanding mental health services.
her ladyship has heard in other modules about the increase in demand for mental health services as a result of the pandemic. And here we are at the end of July with NHS England asking for there to be an expansion and an improvement in mental health services for people with learning disability and or autism, including within this specific reference to children and young people. And if we look just down to the middle bullet point, there's reference there to asking systems to validate, I think it's their long-term priorities of mental health service expansion, improving access to, I think it's psychological therapies, IAPT services should fully resume, a 24/7 crisis helpline should continue, and maintain the growth in the number of children and young people accessing care, proactively reviewing patients, ensuring local access is advertised, and using £250 million of new capital to eliminate mental health dormitory wards. Are they anything to do with children and young people, Mr. Burton? That last bullet.
I would have to come back to you on that one.
All right. And then clearly work being done in the next bullet point down to support people with learning disabilities, autism or both, continuing to reduce the number of children, young people and adults within specialist inpatient setting by providing better alternatives and completing the learning disability mortality reviews by December 2020. Do you know whether this was designed to cope with people who were already in the system, who had mental health difficulties, and or to cope with the new people that were coming forward, children and young people in particular, who had mental health disease, or a bit of both?
A bit of both.
All right.
And I think just, the reason, kind of maintain the growth was because, there was already work happening before the pandemic to scale up services for children and young people's mental health. And in some ways, the pandemic accelerated the need for that. And I think, to go back to hearing the voice of children and young people, certainly we were hearing directly from children and young people about concerns around mental health. And I know the mental health and learning disabilities team heard the same through their connections and routes and working with organisations.
Well, can I ask you about that? I think the inquiry provided you with extracts from the Children and Young People's Voices report that the inquiry commissioned. And clearly in there's reference to the impact on children waiting long times for mental health assessments and the like. Is there anything in that report that surprises you, or does it resonate with what children and young people were telling you in the transformation programme? Yeah,
I mean, when I read that, it certainly resonated with what we were being told, what we heard, and I think it really brings into light the really wide impact of this pandemic on children and young people, not just mental health, but physical health and other concerns. So I think actually this is why this inquiry is really important, particularly for children and young people.
Right. I'd like to just look at some of the specific impacts with you, and in particular starting with hospital care. It's your section E, Mr. Burton, but I think you've made the point that there was no change to be, also there was no advice to change the way care was provided for emergency admissions. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
But in fact, there was a decline in emergency admissions, both in fact for adults and indeed children and young people, presumably in part because we were all going out less. And so there were fewer accidents and a fewer need to call upon emergency.
Yes, I think that's one of the reasons.
Yeah. Now we're going to look at other reasons for various declines, but you say at your paragraph 270 that in April 2020 there were 29,500 fewer planned hospital admissions when compared with the year before. So nearly 30,000 fewer planned hospital. And was that a direct result of the phase 1 letter and the suspension and pausing of elective care?
Yes.
All right. And I think just to show that in real terms, can we have up on screen, please, page 92 of Mr. Burton's statement, and a graph here that shows that for under 18s, elective inpatient admissions dropped off significantly, we can see, if we look at the blue shading, from somewhere in and around the region of about 50,000 in 2018, 2019. And then if you look at the steep decline in and around March and April 2020, helpfully highlighted there, a real drop-off. And then a slow resumption in elective inpatient admissions, climbing thereafter to almost by January 2024, back to roughly where it was pre-pandemic. Now, you said in your statement that, in particular, there was a large proportion of the backlog comprised treatments which were age critical in terms of a child's development. What did you mean by age critical?
Well, I think one of the factors when we look at care for children and young people is the needs of children and young people. So, for example, a child waiting for surgery, maybe a significant proportion of their life that they've been waiting. That has implications for school attendance. It has implications for social interactions with other children, the importance of play, and then that kind of impact, therefore, on their development through their childhood. So, this is why it's really important, clearly, that the impact of waiting in some ways is different than for perhaps an older person waiting. There are different dynamics there.
So it's not just the impact on their physical health, but on their developmental progress. I understand. Now, one may understand why there was the need to pause elective surgeries in the way that you've explained, but perhaps more importantly is how it was recovered thereafter. And can I ask you about that, please? Because you say in your statement of paragraph 279 that there was a slower recovery of elective care for children and young people. And in fact, by November 2021, there was over 63,000 children waiting for an inpatient procedure, nearly 6,000 of which were waiting for dental procedures, 6,000 for specialised surgery, 7,300 for trauma and orthopaedic surgery, and 35,000 waiting for general surgical procedures. Would we think things like tonsillectomies, would that be in the general surgical camp?
It could be, it could be one of the things.
So there's 63,000 children waiting for an inpatient procedure by November 2021. And I think, generally speaking, NHS England accepts that recovery of children's elective surgeries was slower for children than it was for adults. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Now, can you help? Why was it the position that the recovery of elective services is slower for children than it was for adults?
Yeah. Well, I think there are a number of reasons, and I think just to be clear that we started to collect data on this, or on the difference between or disaggregate the elective and non-elective information by age, which meant that from that period of time we could start to see the difference in recovery for children and young people. So I think that was an important step, actually, in terms of being able to identify that there was an issue. There are a number of different reasons as to why that was, and you will see within my statement, a number of pieces of work that were done to try and support children and young people and the elective recovery of children and young people. But clearly, there was a significant backlog across all ages, including adults, and some of the longest waits were within adult services as well. And so there were a number of different pieces of work that were done to try and
I understand, and your statement sets out the pieces of work, but I think that the real question I wanted to try and understand was why is it that the recovery for children was slower than it was for adults?
Yeah. And
maybe there's not one reason, but can you help us with why?
Yeah, if you can just bear with me one moment. So I think if you go to my statement on page 88, paragraph 302, that sets out a number of the kind of key areas why there it's potentially a disparity. Clearly, the waiting list sizes are different, between.
But aren't they smaller for children?
They are smaller.
So
for
shouldn't it be
children.
easier to get through the backlog for children rather than the adult backlog?
Well, except children's services. So on children's services, they're done in more specialist units often. And so that was something that we were seeing happen before the pandemic. We'd seen a shift of some of the elective care into more specialist children's hospitals, which I think, just to remind people, during this period of time, children's services were equally impacted and having to provide support to adult services. So, for example, paediatric intensive care staff and paediatric intensive care capacity had been given over to adults. We had staff that were supporting that. We have a smaller workforce in children and young people as well, who, suffered the same things in terms of sickness absence. So, when we've got smaller waiting lists and there is super specialist care on there, that has an impact if we haven't got the intensive care capacity, the theatre capacity, the anaesthetics. But I think it's reasonable to say that there was a difference in the recovery period as well. And there was investment that was put in at the time and decisions that were taken around investment, which may have benefited, to help support the elective recovery, that may have benefited adults more than children, and that might have been because of some of the high volumes that there were within adults. That's not to say that there wasn't investment put in to help support children and young people. For example, in 2021, there was an investment into some of the specialist children's hospitals of about £20 million to help support some of the elective recovery of children and young people. But I think it's reasonable to say there was a multitude of reasons here, and also because we've got data now, I guess to the extent that was happening before the pandemic, I guess is a slightly unknown.
All right.
phenomenon.
Yes. So you make that point. I think at 302 subparagraph C, there was perhaps a lack of visibility. It wasn't that there was no data, but can I ask you about subparagraph D though? Because the disparity may have been due to children's procedures being seen as less of a priority compared to, for example, adult cancer treatment. Are you able to help, Mr. Burton? By whom was it seen as a less of a priority? NHS England, government, Department of Health, society?
I think I'd find that very difficult to answer. I would say it's probably a mixture of the reasons that were taken to prioritise elements of certain elective care were taken at all different levels. So if I think about some of the decisions around the investment in elective recovery, there was funds that were made available to organisations and to trusts to be able to access. Some of those decisions were down to local systems, organisations around where they needed to put some of the funding to support the elective recovery. So I think it's probably at a number of different levels.
Did you get any sense in your role in the South East region at the time that the recovery of children's procedures was less of a priority?
It's certainly not something that I explicitly recall. In fact, I think we were very focused on making sure that the elective recovery was done for all ages. But clearly that there was, if you look at the scale, and I accept that, there's a difference in terms of the size of the elective waiting list, there was a significant focus also on some of the longest waits, which tended to be in adult services. We had potentially adults that were, waiting for ophthalmology procedures that, their sight would have suffered as well. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there's a balance of prioritisation that was going on, and also not every system was able to recover at the same pace as others, and you'd see kind of particularly as we went through the wave 2 and the latter wave of COVID, it impacted regions in different ways. In the southeast, for example, we saw, particularly in wave 2, Kent very early on hit hard, and then so I think there wasn't one size that kind of fitted all.
Can we be clear? You have said it wasn't something that you explicitly recall that children were less of a priority. Was there ever any diktat, document or advice or guidance sent out that explicitly said children were to be less of a priority when it came to recovering elective care services?
Absolutely not. And I think to the contrary, you will see, and in my statement, we've provided information about where there were, toolkits, guidance, etc., around elective recovery, and certainly the Children and Young People's team, the transformation team, our National Clinical Director, Simon Kenny, for Children and Young People, were heavily thinking about this early on, particularly in kind of the summer of 2020.
Yeah, all right. Well, we can see on screen, though, at paragraph 303, that even by August 2022, the data was suggesting the children's waiting list size was increasing at twice the rate of the adult list. And then you set out below one of the recovery toolkits that NHS England published, setting out what regions, the system and providers, what actions they should take to accelerate the recovery of children's elective services. But can I ask you in a general sense, do you know, Mr. Burton, whether those toolkits and the steps that NHS England took actually did improve the waiting list size for children and young people in England?
Well, we still have a difference. I think it's fair to say we have seen some improvement, but there is still a difference that exists to this day. And I think what we've now got, with the toolkits and the support that's gone in, we now have greater visibility of this. There's a requirement on systems trust to report on this by age and the recovery by age. So there's a greater visibility of this as well.
Can we just have a brief look at just some of the data in relation to the backlogs and the waiting lists? And could I have up on screen, please, page 135 of Mr. Burton's statement? And I just want to look at where the backlogs were being felt most keenly by children and young people, and indeed look at the state of the waiting lists as we move through the pandemic and indeed up to 2024. And we can see on screen, if it helps you, and it's your page 135 as well, Mr. Burton, that there was a ranked list of services reporting existence of a backlog by May, and 82% were reporting a backlog in children and young people's therapy interventions for speech and language. And we can see as we go down that table, percentages decreasing through different services that children and young people needed, all the way down to no backlog in the rapid response services. What are the rapid response services?
So that would be, community children's nursing team that needed to provide, rapid input into care of a child.
So it's
which you'd expect by rapid by nature would mean that you wouldn't be waiting because it's an immediate response.
But significant backlogs as we go back up through that table in relation to speech and language, community paediatric services, occupational therapy, audiology, and everything in between. So that was the kind of services that had the backlogs. And indeed, there is data available on waiting lists that is kept by NHS England across all children's community health services. And I'd just like to look at, please, at page 139 and your paragraph 433, Mr. Burton. We can see here that where data was available, the total wait list across all community health services for children and young people was 215,000 odd at June 2022. It remains stable until winter 23 and 24. But if we look, it's actually rising by the time the table ends in April 2024. And so rather than getting better, it's got worse, if I may put it like that. Can you help with why it is that as we came out of the pandemic and are now no longer in the active stages of the pandemic, the waiting list has continued to increase?
So I think there's a number of different factors here, some of which are, recovery from the pandemic and, the ongoing impact. But there are other things here as well. So there have been increasing numbers of children coming into autism and ADHD services. There's a demand on SEND services as well. And there are continuing to be workforce constraints in some of these services as well. For example, within speech and language therapy and places like that. So demand has not gone down. Demand has continued to go up after the pandemic, and community services are continuing to face pressures from a number of different areas.
Is there any sense that some of the rise might be attributable to people who delayed coming forward in the pandemic and seeking access to community health services? But of course, then you get a rise when eventually they do come forward and they're potentially presenting with worse or certainly not better symptoms.
I don't think I'm able to answer that. I'm happy to look into it, but I don't think I'd be able to give you an answer to that.
If we keep up on screen, though, please, paragraph 434, below the graph, you say there that of the children currently on community health service waiting lists, the largest proportion have been waiting between 18 weeks and a year. And in April 2024, 88,000 odd children have been waiting between 18 weeks and a year. 32 odd thousand have been waiting between a year and 2 years, and over 3,832 children had been waiting over 2 years. So on any view, there is still a large number of children that are waiting from a year upwards for community health services. Can you identify why waiting list sizes could not be reduced and indeed are continuing to rise? And I think if you look at your paragraph 431, Mr. Burton, you might set out there, sorry, paragraph 436, my fault, some of the reasons there why waiting list sizes could not be reduced. And if we go to, that's it, thank you very much, it's coming up on screen now. Providers consistently reported workforce availability and an increase in demand and referrals were the biggest obstacles to reducing the waiting lists. And we can see there the bottom category in dark blue, workforce availability was a key driver of this, increase in demand. Workforce capability and skill mix, does that mean you didn't have the right staff available to deal with these challenges? I see you nodding.
Right, yeah.
What's the other category?
I would have to look at. There may be some very specific local circumstances,
Right.
for example, within that, I would imagine, but I'm very happy to look into the other.
And estate issues, is that because some of the children's wards were given over to adult services?
But I mean, this period of time, October 2022,
Yeah.
I would think that we would start to have been coming out of that. So there may well be other estates-related issues, availability of clinic space. It may be availability of, or the type of estate. It may be temporary closures, those kind of things. But again, we can get more detail if you'd like it.
Well, just whilst on this, again, reported factors preventing reductions in waste, that top green bracket, not considered a priority. And you recall me asking you questions a few moments ago about whether there was a lack of prioritisation. Do you know, does NHS England know why or who it is considered not to be a priority?
Yeah. Well, I think what I would say is I would be very surprised if anybody didn't think that any of our patients or our children and young people are a priority. But what we have to do is clearly weigh up priorities, because there is also within this, there is community weights, not only for children, there are community weights for adults. And I think this is one of the challenges that we all have working in the health services, managing competing priorities and demand for services.
We looked at some generalities. I would like just to spend a few minutes with you looking at some of the other services that were affected by the decisions taken during the pandemic. And in particular, can I ask you about NHS England's public health functions? We know, as you set out in your statement, it's at paragraph 439 onwards, Mr. Burton,
Yep.
that NHS England has some specific public health functions delegated to it by the NHS Act of 2006. I'm not going to ask you about vaccination programmes for COVID, but can I just ask you briefly about vaccinations and immunisation programmes for non-COVID conditions? And I think you say at your paragraph 441 that vaccines are not mandated for children and young people in England. A parent may refuse consent for any or all of the vaccines for children, but children under the age of 16 may be able to provide consent if they are assessed as being competent. So that's the sort of legal framework. There are a number of different vaccines, as you set out at your paragraph 443, for babies under 1, children aged 1, school-aged children. I'm not going to go through all of the vaccines, but it includes things like MMR, meningococcal vaccines, diphtheria, polio, all the usual vaccines that we may have had as children. Can I just ask you about the decision to close schools that was taken? Clearly impacted on the ability for those immunisations that were delivered in school. And do I take it that whilst the school were closed, those immunisation programmes were paused until the school reopened? Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Right. And can you help now with how those immunisations were able to be picked up once schools opened? And have we recovered back to immunisation levels that we had pre-pandemic, or is there a disparity still?
Yeah, so there was a catch-up campaign that was done for those children that had missed or had to have their vaccines paused as a result of that. I think one of the things that I would say is I'm deeply concerned and in some ways terrified by some of the vaccine rates within children and young people. If you look at measles, for example, the cases of measles in this country. We have too many cases of measles. I'm deeply concerned that we have vaccine hesitancy going on now, so we have other things playing in here now.
Well, let me pause you there, because Her Ladyship will have heard a lot about that in the vaccines module, which was clearly focused on the COVID-19 vaccines, and clearly you're talking about a broader range of vaccines. But was NHS England able to recover and ensure that the children that missed out immunisation programmes whilst schools were closed did in fact catch up?
Yes.
Right. Although there are still, obviously, the ongoing concerns by people who perhaps are now vaccine hesitant, not just for COVID-19 vaccines. Yeah. All right. I won't ask you any more about that, please, but can I ask you about dental care? And I think you say in your statement, that paragraph 164, that before the pandemic, rates of tooth decay amongst 5-year-olds had been falling, but by 2020, there was nearly 23.5% of children aged 5 experiencing obvious signs of tooth decay. And can you help really summarise what the impact of the pandemic was on the rates of tooth decay in children and the impact that actually had on children needing surgery for tooth decay?
So I can't give you what was the impact on tooth decay, but in terms of dental services, we had to, during the pandemic, stop routine face-to-face dentistry. Now, we did continue to provide remote advice, analgesia, antimicrobials, etc. There was a service set up to help support those in most need through 111. But clearly there was we had to reduce the services quite significantly, and that did impact children and young people, because actually children and young people are tend to be a heavy user of dental services for the reasons you've explained, but also more routine care that is given. For example, some of the preventative aspects had to stop during the pandemic temporarily whilst whilst we responded to the pandemic.
Yeah, well, in fact, there's a graph that sets out, for example, the proportion of the population that was seen by an NHS dentist during the pandemic. And I have up on screen, please, page 57, and that graph, thank you. And in fact, this covers children and indeed all the way up to adults. But if we look at the green line, which is representing children aged between the ages of 10 to 14, in September 2018, nearly 70% of children in that age bracket were seeing an NHS dentist. And look, it falls then as we enter the pandemic from nearly 70% down to just below 30%. And there are similar declines across the ages of children and, for what it's worth, in adult seeing NHS dentists. And I think you go on to say that tooth decay was the leading reason for hospital admissions in the 5 to 9 age groups. If we look at the red line on this graph, what is it, about 67%-ish were seeing NHS dentists of that age group pre-pandemic. And again, that drops to somewhere around 27, 28% looking at the graph during the pandemic, and indeed drops lowest in March 2021.
So, yeah, this is a 12-month roll-in, so you'll see it impact there.
Steady decline and then a rise. I think you say in your statement that given that tooth decay is the leading reason for hospital admissions in the 5 to 9 age group, and indeed there is a link here with children living in deprived circumstances in particular who were affected, children living in deprived areas are up to 3.5 times higher rates of decay than children living in non-deprived areas. And indeed, there were, if we look at elective admissions for dental care, could we have up on screen, please, page 61, and the graph that we have there. Elective admissions for tooth extractions with a primary diagnosis of dental caries, tooth decay in layman's terms. We can see there was, just over 2,500 children pre-pandemic aged 10 to 17 being admitted for planned tooth extractions. And look, if we look at April 2020, it drops to what is that, below 100 or there or thereabouts? I think 103 children being admitted. So high admissions pre-pandemic, significant drop-off during the pandemic, but clearly a significant impact on children needing tooth extractions for whatever reason. And it's fair to say, I think, Mr. Burton, it's not necessarily that they couldn't see a dentist. There may be other reasons for tooth decay. Does that include children not brushing their teeth?
It absolutely does. And also, sugary foods, sugary drinks, all of those factors impact a child's dental care.
All right. We looked at some specific impacts of the pandemic, but can I ask you about two particular conditions and a change of topic, please, and ask you about paediatric inflammatory multi-system syndrome, PIMS, to use the acronym. And I'd like then to talk separately about long COVID, because they are separate conditions. Is that correct?
That is correct, yeah.
Can you help us with what PIMS actually is?
Yeah, so PIMS TS was it's an inflammatory response that happened that's was found to have happened as a result of COVID for about 4 to 6 weeks after, and can cause quite serious illness in children, impact on organ failure, etc. So it's and resulted in some children in needing intensive care treatment. So this was one thing that was identified actually quite rapidly. Back in April 2020, early in the pandemic, and actually that was identified very quickly because of the significant intelligence networks that we have with frontline clinicians feeding internationally to rapidly respond to that.
I think you say PIMS is quite a rare condition. It affects about 1 in every 3,000 children, but where a child does develop PIMS, actually it often requires hospital admission, if not to paediatric intensive care units. Right. And the first case of PIMS was identified in April 2020, and they say that there was a working group set up in May 2020 to try and reach a consensus on the most appropriate diagnosis and indeed treatment for PIMS. And I think you say there's around 2,000 children affected in England by PIMS.
Yep.
Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. And was the work done in relation to PIMS separate to the work done in relation to long COVID?
Yes.
Right, okay.
and reflective of the rapid need to respond to this very early in the pandemic.
So whilst it is right generally that children were less severely clinically affected by COVID, where there was the contraction of either PIMS or indeed as long COVID, it could actually have very significant and severe and debilitating effects on the children.
Absolutely, yes.
Right. Let me ask you about long COVID then, please. And your paragraph 698. Her ladyship will recall from module 3 that in October 2020, NHS England announced a long COVID plan. And your ladyship may recall that I think Professor Powis had a meeting with a number of the groups that were trying to promote the long COVID effects on children. And it was in October 2020 that the plan was announced by NHS England. Can you help me with this? The long COVID plan did not explicitly include provision for children or expressly refer to children and young people in the plan. Do you know why there wasn't express reference to long COVID in children in the October 2020 plan?
As far as I was aware, this was it was an all-age plan, so wasn't specifically called out. And again, I guess just to say, October 2020, this was also new and emerging in terms of a condition, and therefore, understanding what needs to happen.
By June 2021, though, NHS England had committed to establishing 15 hubs for children and young people with long COVID. And those hubs included paediatric services and extending access to clinical expertise in that field. You have seen, though, I think, Mr. Burton, concern that notwithstanding the work done by NHS England with both the plan and indeed the hubs, there was real concern that there was delay in the recognition of long COVID amongst paediatricians. And can I just ask through you to have a look, please, at INQ 000587960_2022. This is an extract from an expert report by Dr. Siegel and Professor Whitaker that was commissioned by the inquiry. And at their paragraph 49, they had made reference above to a delay in the collective realisation, as they call it, that long COVID affected children. There was likely also a minimisation and disbelief by some healthcare professionals. They say invisible disabilities are recognised as challenging for people to understand, hence disabled children and young people may not be believed. Some children's symptoms were thought to be due to reasons other than long COVID, such as mental health presentations, symptom exaggeration, school refusal, and some long COVID diagnoses were dismissed. And indeed, some clinicians labelled parents as anxious, hypervigilant, and assumed exaggeration of their children's symptoms, again refuting long COVID diagnosis and support. Did you get any sense in your role at the time that there was some paediatricians and clinicians minimising and disbelieving children presenting with long COVID symptoms?
So it's not something personally I came across in my interactions with clinicians. In fact, from an NHS England perspective, I think our clinicians, certainly our National Clinical Director for Children and Young People, was concerned about this, fairly early on, and recognising that this was a new disease process. Back in kind of June, July time, where, and would say to me, if he was here now, that actually clinicians will recognise that whenever a virus impacts somebody, there might well be some post-viral process that occurs. And I think, therefore, what you see in the response from NHS England is very much as we got more understanding of this, services being set up, and also, services being deliberately set up for children and young people. But I can also understand from reading, the statement that is online here, this was also a time when there was a very kind of confused picture going on. So I can understand the fact that, we had children impacted by disruption in education and the impacts of the pandemic that would have also, caused other concerns at the time.
Right. I think you've also seen that there were indeed children and young people that contributed to the Children and Young People's Voices report who made similar comments to those by the experts, where they felt they were being dismissed or they weren't being taken seriously and the like. Can you help with, from NHS England's perspective, what did NHS England do to try and either improve the understanding of paediatric long COVID or to remedy the minimisation of long COVID symptoms? What steps did NHSE take?
Absolutely. So I think, look, we took a number of different steps to support this. So certainly our clinicians worked with organisations of family representatives that were focused on long COVID, certainly held a number of webinars to provide information, advice, guidance. You've got the NICE guidance that was put out in September of 2020. There was funding that was put in for, I think £10 million worth of funding that was put in October to set up COVID clinics. There was additional funding then in 2021, I think £2.5 million of which was dedicated for children and young people's long COVID services. So I think, this was clearly new and emerging, and as that more information and evidence base came online, that was being used to communicate.
Just finally on long COVID, I think you say in your paragraph 707 onwards, in relation to data on children and young people with long COVID, clearly data was eventually obtained. One understands why it couldn't be until indeed long COVID was formally recognised as a condition. But in terms of monitoring and reporting data by the Children and Young People's Long COVID hubs, you say there was data on the number of referrals collected from March 2021 to June 2022. The results weren't published, though, because the small numbers could lead to identification, and only 8 out of 14 of the hubs regularly submitted data. And in fact, there was poor data completion and poor data quality, hence why the data wasn't, in fact, published. Can you help with what efforts, if any, have been made to improve data collection in relation to children and young people with long COVID?
That is something I'm not able to answer. I'm happy to come back with a response on that.
All right. Can I turn to some overarching observations, please, with you, Mr. Burton? And you say in your lessons learned and recommendations section of your statement that the needs of children and young people can easily be overlooked, and pandemic preparedness needs to account for the physiological differences, but the emotional, developmental, educational differences and the like. What is NHS England doing to prepare now for those and take account of those different needs and demands that a pandemic may have on a children and young person?
And I think if I can just draw this into two spaces.
Certainly.
So I think there is, we have to be prepared for a pandemic that impacts children and young people in a way that perhaps the COVID didn't directly impact. So if a virus happened tomorrow and a pandemic occurred that impacted children and young people, if you think, if I just simply put the kind of, we've got, just over 3,000 level 3 critical care beds for adults. We've got 312 that are commissioned for children. So the scale of stepping up a response for children is different. The children's workforce is smaller. Even kind of, I'm an adult trained nurse, but drug calculations for children are that much more complex. There's a whole complexity around the workforce and that we would need to consider. That's not to say that you couldn't change some of the adult critical care capacity for children, those older children, but clearly we need to be prepared for a pandemic that directly impacts. There are then also, and I think particularly the learning from this pandemic, is the indirect impacts of children and young people. So clearly the kind of, as you've said, the education impacts on health and well-being and mental health. So in terms of what we are doing, I would like just to draw you to attention into the pack around the kind of direct impact. We did almost have an incident within an incident around RSV and the impact on children and young people. And I think it's important to just refer to that, because that gave us the opportunity to think about how do we scale up and respond to an increase in a significant increase in RSV at the time for children and young people, so surge plans.
Pause there, Mr. Byrne, because not everyone will know what RSV is. I know it's a respiratory virus, and I can never pronounce the second.
Syncytial. Yeah.
Thank you. Just help us. What is it, and why is it such a concern for children and young people?
Yeah, so it's a respiratory virus that we've tended to get an annual increase in every single year, which puts extreme pressure across the health service, including into paediatric intensive care units, primary care, etc. And what we saw happen during the pandemic was, because children weren't mixing in 2020, we were concerned going into 2021 that we would see a resurgence of that, and we did. We saw it earlier, and we saw, I think it was 7 times the normal kind of levels of RSV than previous years. And I think that's important, because one of the things that has come out of the pandemic is that we will see resurgences of other viruses and conditions that will happen. And so, being prepared for that's really important. And just to go back to my point earlier about the importance of vaccines, we now have a vaccine for RSV since last year, available for pregnant women to protect them, to protect babies and young people. And this is why actually keeping vaccination rates high is something that's really important across the board for all conditions going into a pandemic.
Can I come back to the preparedness point,
yes,
though? Because I think you say in your statement that there was no national pandemic preparedness exercises that NH England was either involved in or aware of that focused on the specific needs of children and young people.
Yeah.
And can I ask you that? It may be difficult to answer, but had there been, what difference do you think it would have made during the pandemic?
I think that's a very difficult question
because
to answer.
Wouldn't we still have had to suspend or
yes,
pause elective care,
yes,
given the influx of numbers? Let me ask you a different way then. What do you perceive the benefits being of a specific children and young people focused pre-pandemic preparedness exercise?
I think the benefits of that are a greater preparedness for areas such as, how do you scale up critical care services for children and young people? What do we need to do around the equipment that's available, the workforce, the training, all of those considerations? And also, I think it's to test out what some of the unintended consequences might be of making those decisions. So particularly with the smaller children and young people's workforce, if you have to scale up into more critical care services with children's experienced nurses, doctors, etc. What does that do to other parts that we might need to continue to make sure happen?
Do you think that would also include potentially looking at the consequences of redeployment?
Yes.
We have later this afternoon a witness coming from the Institute of Health Visiting who is concerned about the number of health visitors that were redeployed during the pandemic. And clearly, an impact of redeployment has been that the healthcare system was unable to recover as quickly as we looked at. So clearly, do you know if Operation Pegasus has included a focus on the specific needs of children and young people?
I think it would be wrong for me to be able to say that at the moment. I've been taken part in the early days of the simulation, and I think we will need to see what the next phase is for me to be able to confirm that either way.
All right. Just finally from me, please, one of the other final reflections you have is ensuring that children and young people's interests are represented in formal response structures. Clearly, NHS England has the transformation programme and the board that you told us about right at the beginning of your evidence. But can you give us any concrete recommendations or ideas for how there could be better engagement with children and young people?
Well, I think just to say, I think we really did try to keep the voice of children and young people at the core of everything we did. So I think any response or any future response needs to continue to make sure that we have not only a focus on children through all of the kind of all-age services that we provide, but also a kind of coordinating point, which the Children and Young People's Transformation Board in many ways did during this pandemic, to bring together those different components across NHS England, Department for Education and others. The other one thing I would say, which I think is an important recommendation, is around data, because I think what we've seen, and you've taken me through lots of data this morning, is that the importance of being able to disaggregate data by age is important, and also the work that needs to be done, and there's a commitment in the 10-year health plan around a unique identifier for children and young people, which crosses beyond just health into other areas like education and social care. So I think having these additional things will enhance any response.
Yeah. Can I ask you about that? Because you set it out at your paragraphs 811 and 812, and I smile because you're not the last witness, and certainly not the first witness either to have mentioned data to her ladyship. But can we be realistic, Mr. Burton? How realistic do you think it would be to have a single unique identifier for each child across not just health systems, but social care systems as well, and educational services, which would effectively link up health, social care and education? It sounds wonderful in theory, but how realistic is it in practice?
Well, look, there's clearly work to be done to get to that point, and in many ways, I think we're certainly looking at whether the NHS number is the unique identifier, because everybody has an NHS number. I don't think it's a question of realism. It's a question of we need to do this because it's really important. Children, and as you've seen kind of from the unintended consequences, children are not an island. This isn't, you can't put a child in a health box, in an education box, in a social care. It crosses over, safeguarding crosses over all of those. So I think this is not a question of whether we should do it. We have to do this and find a way to do it.
Right. Mr. Burton, there are all the questions that I have for you. I know there are some core participant questions, but I wonder, my lady, if it might be sensible to take our mid-morning break and return to the core participants after that.
Certainly. I understand you're content to come back after the break, Mr. Burton.
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. As we've got through quickly, you can have till 25 to 12 for a break.
Thank you, my lady. My lady, thank you. I hope you can see and hear me okay.
And thank you.
And it's Miss Beattie on behalf of the Disabled People's Organisations to ask questions next.
Thank you. Miss Beattie.
Thank you, my lady. Mr. Burton, I ask questions on behalf of National Disabled People's Organisations. On the 3rd of June 2020, a letter was sent by NHS England and NHS Improvement providing guidance on the restoration of community health services for children and young people. And that letter said at page 5 that children's allied health professional services, for example, speech and language therapy or wheelchair services, should be partially restored subject to prioritisation. Mm-hmm. And at page 11, it said that under the Coronavirus Act, reasonable endeavours had to be made to ensure that the provision in a child's education, health and care plan was delivered. But despite this, concerns were repeatedly raised well into the pandemic throughout 2021 that allied health professionals working with children were being inappropriately redeployed. Do you accept that redeployment of allied health professionals continued for far too long, and that the steps taken to ensure that they returned to critical work with disabled children were insufficient?
So thank you. I think I would just go back to the scale of the challenge in 2020 and the scale of the challenge that all services were having to respond to in terms of redeploying staff, be that allied health professionals, nurses, medical. We had to respond throughout the period of the pandemic to different waves of COVID, which meant that we had staff sickness, which meant that we had to continue to support the efforts around critical care, elective recovery. There were steps that were taken, and I think within my evidence pack there is a letter that was sent, I think, in December 2020 by the chief allied health professional around about the restoration of allied health professionals back into community services and the importance of that. But I think it's also important to remember it's very easy to stop things, but actually to scale them back up and restart them is sometimes more difficult given the scale of the challenges that were happening at the time.
I mean, were you aware that some of those concerns involved things like inappropriate redeployment of therapists to cleaning roles?
I'm not aware that therapists were redeployed to cleaning roles. It's certainly never something that hasn't come up to me in my time in my roles.
And that those concerns, particularly from the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists, persisted throughout 2021, such that they were issuing open letters as late as November 2021 concerned about that redeployment?
I haven't seen those specific letters from the Speech and Language Therapy organisation.
The language in the June 2020 guidance letter that reasonable endeavours were required to secure provision for children with education, health and care plans was used, and it did not say, for example, that all practical steps should be taken to deliver that provision to children with education, health and care plans. Do you agree that that language did not adequately convey the urgency of what are critical services for disabled children and young people delivered through education, health and care plans?
I guess, again, what I would come back to is the scale of the challenge at the time. I think regardless of the framing of the language, and I absolutely appreciate for disabled children and young people the pressures that were on them and their needs as well. But in the context of June 2020, where we had still COVID cases, we still had high numbers of staff off sick, we still had to be continuing to respond to the needs of the pandemic and restore services, I think it's not unreasonable to have expected people to make their best endeavours to restore services. And also, I think that I am mindful about the fact that, and certainly within my roles in the region and my experience of being a trust chief nurse, we would have expected locally for that guidance, that letter to be interpreted and to tailor the needs for the local community.
Thank you, Marlene.
You're up next.
Thank you, my lady. Mr. Burton, I ask questions on behalf of clinically vulnerable families, and I have two questions about paragraph 84 of your witness statement on page 31, and that's where you've outlined analysis of the number of deaths in children in England from COVID-19. This analysis estimated that 88 children and young people died of COVID-19 in England during the first 26 months of the pandemic. You went on to explain that 90% of those children had an underlying chronic condition. Mr. Burton, if they had an underlying chronic condition, can you confirm that those 90% of children who died from COVID-19 would have been classed as clinically vulnerable?
I wouldn't be able to specifically confirm for every single one of those cases. I mean, it's something we can look at, but I wouldn't want to give you a definitive answer on that. I would imagine that some of them would be, but I wouldn't want to.
Would it be fair to infer that most, if not all, of those children with underlying chronic conditions would tend to be clinically vulnerable?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Would it be fair to infer that those children with underlying chronic conditions are clinically vulnerable?
I think you could make that inference, but again, in terms of were they on a shielding list or something, I couldn't confirm that.
Thank you. And the second question, you go on to say that 80% of the children who died had a life-limiting condition. And can I ask, does the category life-limiting condition include children with serious but manageable conditions which may affect their life expectancy, for example, type 1 diabetes, or is it limited only to conditions where a death is expected regardless of management?
Again, sorry, could you repeat the question?
So that paragraph 84 refers to 80% of the children who died having a life-limiting condition, and I'm just trying to explore there whether you mean when you say life-limiting condition, do you mean children with a serious but manageable condition which may affect their life expectancy, or do you mean conditions where death is expected regardless of the management of that condition?
Again, I can look into the definitions of this, but I mean, you use diabetes as an example there. That I wouldn't consider as a life-limiting condition, that it's a manageable condition.
Thank you, Ms. Burton.
Thank you, Ms. Douglas. Mr. Broach, should be across the hearing room.
Thank you, my lady. Mr. Burton, I appeal for the children's rights organisations. Could I ask, please, what assessment, if any, did NHS England make of whether both service suspensions during the pandemic and the shift to digital-first models disproportionately impacted children from low-income or otherwise disadvantaged families?
Thank you. So, again, I don't think I'm able to answer what specific assessment happened in relation to that, but certainly there was due consideration given to the change of services to digital online, be that for adults or for children, and that's why there was never a blanket, everything has to move online. So if there were families or children and young people that couldn't access care via digital means, there was an expectation, those needing emergency care, for example, continued to receive that face-to-face.
Do you accept that there should be formal assessment of whether those kinds of changes are going to have a disproportionate impact on particularly vulnerable groups?
I think with anything that we do at NHS England or within the NHS, we should consider all types of inequalities and the impact of inequalities in everything that we should do.
Thank you. And were children and or families consulted as part of any consideration of the consequences and the proportionality of the impact of these measures?
Again, can you just be in relation to the change to online?
The suspension of various services and the change to digital-first working.
So I think given where we were at the pandemic and the initial response had to be very much around, there wasn't wide consultation that was done on some of these changes because of the nature of the emergency that we were in, and we were having to do guidance in a matter of hours and days to be able to do this. So a normal type of consultation that we would normally do on significant changes didn't happen in that respect, but we did try to make sure where guidance had been issued as we went through the pandemic. You can see that changes were made to guidance as we got more input from different organisations and people.
Thank you, Mr. Burton. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Mr. Broach. That completes the questions we have for you, Mr. Burton. You mentioned a number of times the need for planning and the need for better data. You don't have to persuade me of that after all the evidence I've heard during the course of the inquiry so far, and I'm sure I'm going to hear more. So thank you very much indeed for the help that you've given to the inquiry and in preparing the witness statement that you have. And I don't know if you had colleagues help you with preparing the witness statement and preparing for today, but could you also pass on my thanks to them for their help?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much. And my lady, there'll just be a brief pause while we bring in the next witness, who's Professor Steve Turner. Yes, I think the witness can be sworn, please.
Can you take the Bible in your right hand, please, and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Take a seat.
Thank you for coming to help us, Professor Turner.
You're very welcome.
Professor, your full name, please.
Yes, good morning. Yeah, I'm Stephen William Turner.
Thank you. You are, I believe, the President of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health
I am.
and have been in that position since March 2024.
Yes.
I think prior to that, as you set out in your statement, which is INQ 651508, you were the RCPCH, for short, Registrar from spring 2021 to spring 2024, and the Officer for Scotland in the 5 years preceding that.
That is correct.
All right. I think you are a consultant paediatrician in general and respiratory paediatrics, currently practicing in the Royal Aberdeen Children's Hospital.
That is correct.
All right. Now, I think, Professor, you set out in your statement a little bit about RCPCH. You are the membership body for paediatricians and have over 24,000 members across the UK. Right. And I think you may have been present when the Chief Nursing Officer just gave evidence this morning.
I was.
Clearly, we had an England focus with that witness, but if at any time you're able to help us with the position in the devolved nations, please feel free to do so, not least because RCPCH is a UK-wide body.
With pleasure.
All right. The Royal College is responsible for education, training, setting professional standards, and informing research and policy, as you set out. And I think during the pandemic, you explained that the college engaged with a number of NHS organisations, NHS England, Public Health England, as was, now UK HSA, Department of Health and Social Care, Department for Education, and indeed your college officers in the devolved nations having similar engagement with governments and organisations, perhaps less so in Northern Ireland, though, in the run-up to the pandemic, given the state of the government as it was in the few years preceding 2020.
Yes.
Right. Can I ask you at the outset, you say at your paragraph 7, the extent to which the public bodies ensured children and young people were central to decision-making varied throughout the pandemic. Can I ask you, please, are you able to give us an example of some good government decision-making which focused on children and young people? And then I'm going to ask you for perhaps an example where there wasn't that focus.
You start with the harder question. I think that just to start, going back to March 2020, they were unspeakably difficult times with a lot of uncertainty, and I think that collectively across the UK, the governments made the most sensible decision in doing what they did. And this is a theme that I might come back to a few times in the time that we've got together. The revision, the reassessment of that with a focus on children would, and I argue should, have been made, and changes should have been made. So in answer to your question, what did governments do well? I think governments recognised that what they were doing to children was causing them huge indirect harm. I think there was awareness of that. But the focus of government, which was understandable at the time, was to look after the other end of the age range. So I think to be, and I have great sympathy, and I spoke to lots of people who were in the thick of things in those days. In the absence of any experience, in the absence of data, initially those decisions were understandable. So, fair enough. In answer to your question, what did they not do so well? And I think this is across all 4 nations. There was not enough respect given to children. There was not enough consideration given to the innumerable, harmful, indirect harm that was done to them as a consequence of the provisions made around COVID. And those decisions and the low priority of children in our society, which actually is everybody's responsibility in this room, continues to frustrate me, annoy me, but enthuse me to carry on championing for children and young people.
Did you, or the Royal College get any sense of why there wasn't enough consideration given to, in particular, the indirect harms? Is it the fault of one department, one person, systemic? Can you help?
I can contribute. I think that when we started, children were on the second tier of priorities for us as a nation. I think if you look at the investment, childhood outcomes, so for example, mortality rates, obesity rates, mental health rates, asthma deaths, these were all going in the wrong direction before the pandemic started. So it's not a surprise to me that when the pandemic then hit us, that the well-being of children was always going to be on a lower trajectory, a poorer trajectory than that for adults. So I think if you break down the time course into what happened before the pandemic and then what happened during the pandemic, it's not a surprise that there was an awareness of children. I'm sure there was, because politicians will have had children and grandchildren. There would have been that awareness, but that awareness did not translate to a consideration of what harm are we doing to our children. There was no reflection on that. And if there was reflection, I didn't see any evidence of it. And 5 years down the line, I was in clinic on Monday seeing 5-6-year-olds who are still not toilet trained, and they missed out on the opportunity. So children continue today to suffer for what we did during the pandemic, which is a partial reflection of what was already happening beforehand.
All right, understood. We might look at some of the indirect impacts during the course of your evidence. But I think one of the things that perhaps might be emerging is the extent to which there was engagement with children and young people, and therefore a focus on them. Can you help, from your perspective and the college's perspective, was there sufficient engagement with children and young people? We've heard about, from the previous witness, a transformation board that was in place by NHS England, but perhaps UK-wide, was there sufficient engagement?
There's always room for more engagement.
Of course.
You'll not be surprised to hear me say that. So as a college, we have children in our name. One of our roles is to advocate for children, because on a national level there are very few advocates for children. We believe we're one of them. We have a group called Anders, and we sought the experiences of young people, and we expressed and reflected these views of their experiences across the 4 nations to governments and to other stakeholders. And I think that if you cast your mind back, those of people who had school children at that time, there were children everywhere. You could not avoid the fact that there were children sitting at home on tech, not doing anything. And so I think the plight of children was, people were aware of it. But what I did not see was a translation of that awareness into something being done about it. And I'll just briefly talk about schools. We put out a statement in May 2020, recognising the difficult decision that, it is a risk to reopen schools, but it took an awful long time before that happened. And then it was done with social distancing and masks, and it was just not considering the well-being of children.
Before I look at some of those impacts, I think one of the things you do say in your statement is that the college sought for children and young people to be more central to public communications in the pandemic, which I suspect ergo would help them engage with the issues. And I think you say that the Royal College wrote to the Prime Minister, amongst others, asking him to host a briefing on children and young people, but that suggestion was not taken up. And you also wrote to the Secretary of State, Matt Hancock, to meet with children and young people. I'd just like to look at the letter that was written. Can we have up on screen, please, INQ 000 620 590. We are in October 2020. So it's really now with a view to planning for the winter pressures and potentially a wave 2. And we can see as we scroll down that the college wanted to have the opportunity to work with the Secretary of State to empower more young people and young adults UK-wide to understand their role in the next phase of the pandemic, to follow and support others. And you set out how to try and mobilise what is up to 25% of the UK population and a 3-fold plan. Continue to support and promote young people as advocates, develop young people-focused COVID-19 messaging, and thirdly, thank you, create with you, Secretary, an opportunity for conversation with us as Health Youth Ambassadors. And it was, you said, young people already working with other UK government teams and departments and charities to support parts 1 and 2. But we'd like to start working with you and your team on scoping 3 and an end-of-year youth / Secretary of State conversation. Mm-hmm. And I think you have seen, Professor, a response from not Mr. Hancock himself, but someone in their correspondence team. And if we go to page 3, the DHSE team responded in November on the 30th, apologising for the delay, making the point that it was a busy time for Mr. Hancock and was unable to commit to a meeting at that stage, and then setting out a number of things that the government says it was doing in relation to promoting the needs and welfare of children. It says the government takes child health very seriously. It knows that getting more children back in school is vital for their education and their well-being, particularly for the most vulnerable and disadvantaged. And I won't read out the whole letter, but if we go to this next page, please. An acknowledgement that the pandemic has left young people feeling anxious. There's been advice given. NHS services remain open, and the government is providing 9.2 million of funding to national and local mental health charities to support adults and children affected by the pandemic. A number of issues to pick up there with you, please. Firstly, this, generally speaking, was the Royal College satisfied with the response that it got from, in response to its letter?
We accepted that it was a busy time, and I'm sure Mr. Hancock was busy. But obviously we were disappointed that we were given soothing words which we could challenge, but we weren't given an opportunity to do that. Yeah.
One part of the plan was to develop young people-focused COVID-19 messaging. Mm-hmm. Why was it considered by the college important that messaging should be particularly tailored to children and young people?
Well, it's always better to do things with people than to them. And I get less young all of the time. And I don't speak... The way I might put a message across might not be the same way that a young person would either want to put it across or want to receive it. So we're very keen to co-produce things with young people.
We've heard, and indeed there is evidence from NHS England in particular, about decline in attendance at A&E, decline in attendance at GP appointments, late presentation of children with various health difficulties. Do you think that tailored communications to children would have perhaps ameliorated some of that decline?
Yeah, I think young people would have liked a message to say, we know it is rubbish out there. We know that when your parents are fed up with you, you're grounded. And I know that the country's grounded you for months. We know, we realise it, and we're really sorry about it. That was just never said.
Do you think it would have made a difference if there had been an acknowledgement?
I think just that acknowledgement and that recognition at the top level of what was being done deliberately to children and young people, knowingly and wantonly, recognising all of the harm that it was doing, and there's a whole list of indirect harms that were done. Would it have made a difference? I certainly don't think it would have made any harm.
No. I think you do set out in your statement some of the work the college did, in particular the RCPCH and US programme. Can you just briefly summarise what that programme is for us?
Yeah, so that's our group of hugely energetic, enthusiastic youth workers who go up and down the country to capture the voice of young people, to work with young people, to help the young people provide a voice to the college and to other external stakeholders.
Right. And at your paragraph 43, you give a number of examples of key projects that the college was involved in. There was 360 children and young people engaged by the college, sharing their challenges, concerns, hopes and ideas. I understand that. There was also 74,000 children and young people's voices that were peer-reviewed by the college in relation to themes relating to lockdown. Mm-hmm. Now, I understand that Professor, but are you able to help with any themes in relation to healthcare, either access of or provision of, rather than the broader harms that lockdown brought to children?
I'll try to summarise 72,000 voices. So from memory, I think you can break them down into two. There's children who didn't have health problems going into the pandemic, and children who already had health problems. So if I do those in reverse order, I think that there were anxieties about children who had asthma, epilepsy, diabetes, about, who's there for them. They can't get in touch with their usual clinicians, or if they do, it's difficult. So they were one set of anxieties around healthcare. And then, as you mentioned before, there were children who didn't have healthcare problems, mental healthcare problems before COVID, but these emerged. And this, there was stories of people feeling lonely, anxious, and these were captured. There are many themes that have captured, but they were mostly themes of isolation, sadness and need. I don't think there were any warm, satisfying themes that came out.
You mentioned there particularly mental health care problems, and that Her Ladyship is very familiar with the rise in demand for CAMHS services, to use the acronym, and other similar mental health services. And I think in September 2021, is it right, the college made a number of recommendations to the Health and Social Care Select Committee, which included ring-fenced funding for children and adolescent mental health services, and also asked for an overarching child health strategy. Mm-hmm. Can I ask, why was it the college was so keen for there to be an overarching child health strategy?
I think this goes back to what I was saying before, to increase awareness of children to the wider society, to the wider healthcare system as it was being reorganised, to keep children, in the aim to get children in the centre of the vision, because our concern was that children were barely on the periphery of the vision of the government.
Turning to some of those impacts, we know that staff were redeployed from paediatric settings to help care for adult COVID-19 patients. And I think the college agrees and acknowledges that the impact was particularly felt on children from deprived backgrounds who already had worse health outcomes. And Her Ladyship has already heard about that. But is it right that the college conducted 2 projects during the pandemic to look at perhaps why there was drops in paediatric attendance in acute and indeed in community settings?
We did 2 surveys.
2 surveys,
yes.
Yep.
So we did one early on and then one over the Christmas of 2021.
All right, can I ask you about those? And if it helps you, it's paragraph 18 onwards in your statement. But I think perhaps if we have up on screen, please, a summary of some of the consequences of lockdown before I come to the surveys. Can I have up on screen, please, INQ 00620599_1. This just looks at some of the unintended consequences, and then we'll look at the findings of the surveys themselves.
Yeah.
And if we go to the middle of the page, the paragraph beginning these benefits, you say the benefits are overshadowed by the negative consequences of lockdown. First and foremost is the direct impact. Emergency departments in the UK experience unprecedented reductions of greater than 50% in attendances. In Scotland, children's emergency department attendances fell proportionally more than any other age group, raising concerns that children with critical illnesses were not accessing health services on time, and therefore suffering potentially avoidable harm. Do you know if the position was the same in Wales and Northern Ireland?
I imagine it was, but I don't have any confirmed evidence.
All right. And if we just go to the next paragraph, at the end of April 2020, there was a snapshot survey of more than 4,000 paediatricians across the UK and Northern and Ireland. And 60% of those who responded had witnessed delayed presentations, particularly in responses revealing, was it delayed presentations in diabetes, children with diabetes?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And delayed presentations of sepsis and new cancer diagnosis, And indeed, there were 9 deaths resulting mainly from sepsis and malignancy, where delayed presentation was considered by the reporting paediatrician to be a significant contributing factor, higher than the total number of childhood COVID-19 deaths reported over the same period in England. It's not easy to understand why there was the delayed presentation, but I think at the bottom of that page there are potential reasons given for it, including parents strictly adhering to the stay-at-home messaging, parental concerns about getting COVID in hospital, not wanting to disturb doctors during the pandemic as well, and perhaps any combination of those reasons. Do you think the stay-at-home messaging for people who urgently needed healthcare provision got the balance right?
Bear in mind this was in the fairly early days of the pandemic. So this is March, April, May time. I have the benefit of being able to look back at whole population data over that period. So I think the short answer to your question is that probably the stay-at-home message was not wrong. So when you look at diabetes, which is, many people know is a problem with insulin, it can be very sick, very life-threatening. What we know during the pandemic year of starting March 2020 through to February 21 is that there were, for reasons nobody really understands, more new cases of diabetes, and they were more likely to present in a more serious way. So twice as many we need to go to intensive care. But interestingly, and the researchers looked at time for symptoms, and there was no major increase in delay that might have explained that. So there's no doubt that time confirms these initial observations that diabetes outcomes were much worse during that year. But it's not obviously due to delayed presentations.
Right. I think I won't put it up on screen, but I think the paper that we're looking at there goes on to be concerned about lack of referrals for child protection assessments. I think also you have seen there were concerns about reductions in cancer referrals. In particular, NHSE has data on that, and delays in presentations in child protection cases. So health impacts, societal impacts, developmental, and indeed child protection impacts. Now, the reasons for those delays, as we look, maybe myriad, but certainly from the perspective of the college, the 2 surveys that were conducted, one of the concerns was about the impact of redeployment of paediatric healthcare staff and the loss of paediatric inpatient space and how indeed we would recover once there had been the suspension of elective care. And if I look, please, and ask for your paragraph 21 to be called up on screen, we can see there the main findings of the first phase of the project, which ran from April to July 2020. There's about 10% of staff not available to work because they may have been shielding, understood. Other staff working in different ways, remote working. But up to 46% of community trainees were redeployed to acute paediatric care. And by the end of the data collection period, 10% were still not working in community settings. It's worrying because of the importance of community services for vulnerable children and the backlog of work, such as child protection, medicals. Redeployment is a tricky issue. And can I ask, generally speaking, did the college agree with the initial decision to redeploy paediatric healthcare professionals? Or did they not disagree with it? Might be a better way of pushing it.
I wouldn't like you to think that we had the choice.
No.
And I think, going back to what I said at the start, we had to make some very pragmatic decisions as a society back in March 2020. So I think I wouldn't disagree with them. I'll just leave that hanging because I'm sure there's a question coming from you.
Paediatric inpatient space lost to adult services was small but important, with reported issues getting the space back. Are you able to say or give us an idea for how long there were the issues with? Obviously, it was handed over to adult inpatient, but how long were these issues with getting it back persisting for?
Months in some instances, and relatively small, but the loss of community space was much greater and much more prolonged.
Did the college take any steps to try and raise this as an issue or lobby?
Well, we highlighted the survey. You'll imagine that the atmosphere was very noisy at the time. So we did highlight this, and as I'm sure we'll come on to, we repeated the survey later on that year.
Well, let's look at that, please.
Yeah.
We have on screen paragraph 23, because the survey was conducted, I think, later that year. Here we are. Thank you.
Yeah.
The survey started at the very end of November, right the way through to February 2021. And we can see there that the key findings from the survey include 30% of services had redeployed paediatric trainees to adult services at the peak in mid-January 2021. And 13% of services reported that consultants had been redeployed to adult services at the peak in late January 2021, which in fact was, do I take it that was worse than those that had been redeployed during the first wave?
Yeah, it wasn't mentioned, so I don't think there were many consultants redeployed earlier on that year.
Right.
Yes, and the implication of that is that it left holes in rotas, it left trainees being untrained, and it meant that lots of things that should have happened in a schedule context didn't take place.
The inquiry is aware that, in fact, there were more adult inpatients in hospital in Wave 2 over the winter 2021, in particular winter 2020 to 21, and in particular January 2021, than there were in Wave 1.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wondered whether you had any observations to make on whether the fact that there was needed to be this redeployment of staff was because there was any failure to plan for winter 2020 or 2021.
I'm not really in a position to comment knowledgeably on that.
Okay. I think you also go on to say that there were paediatric intensive care units that were affected.
Yes.
And 7 out of 23 paediatric intensive care units were repurposed for adult services, which had a neighbouring impact on their local other paediatric units who had to sort of take up the slack, if I may put it colloquially.
Absolutely.
Do you know, Professor, whether there was any impact on the care provided to children who needed intensive care by the fact that some of those services had now been repurposed to look after adults?
No, because I think the issue was that it was the paediatric trained staff who were then looking after adults. So I think that the people looking after children were appropriately trained and experienced. But if I may also say that this obviously had impact for time-critical surgery, heart operations. So as with all these things, there were many indirect implications.
And I think generally the impacts of either the redeployment, the pausing of community health services and elective care, and indeed some of the changes to the amount of the estate that was given over to adults, all has generally interrupted community care for children and young people, meaning waiting lists are climbing. Is that correct?
That is correct.
All right, now we had a look at some of those with the witness that preceded you. Yeah. But can I ask you, please, about the current position, and have on screen, please, INQ 000 620 603. And so we saw with the Chief Nursing Officer that they had begun to rise by the end of 2024. And to bring this more up to date, there is a Royal College news report from May 2025, which shows that new analysis as of March this year, there were over 314,000 children waiting for essential community health service. Shockingly, this figure represents a rise from February to March, meaning a further 16,000 children are waiting for vital treatment. A more sort of, with those sobering statistics in mind, can you help at all as to why the college thinks that recovery of elective care for children was slow and slower than it was for adults, as we heard from Mr. Burton?
I think it probably boils down to priority. I think that children coming into the pandemic were of relatively low priority relative to adults. During the pandemic, I think that gap widened, and I think they became the lowest of priorities. And I think coming out of the pandemic, the priority for recovery, for restoration of normal services, again, didn't focus on children. Children were second or third rate. I think what's also important to point out is that the child health workforce, and I'm here talking about paediatricians, but I'm talking about the wider workforce that looks after children in the community and in hospitals. It was a really difficult time.
Yeah.
People had to work there was a lot of friction. They were expected to do things they weren't trained to do. They were put in situations that really frustrated them. And if you look at the January 21 census, 15% of the paediatric people responses, they had colleagues who were off with stress. So I think that the friction, the emotional turmoil of going through all of this impacted on the workforce. And again, I think this is across the whole of the sector. And I think that is also going to be part of why we're in the pickle that we are at the moment.
Well, I will echo with evidence her ladyship has heard in other modules, I've no doubt. But can I perhaps come back to something we started with, and your paragraph 27, please, Professor. And you said this: the college recognises that necessity meant that services had to be reconfigured or paused, including the redeployment of child health professionals to adult services, and recognises this was the right thing to do initially. I suspect you might emphasise the word initially.
Yeah, absolutely.
You say, but however, the college was alive to the potential impact. What does the college say about whether thereafter, once the eye of the storm, if I may put it like that, had passed, what focus was given to helping healthcare for children and young people to recover?
So what might have happened in an alternative parallel universe is that evidence which was collected was used, experience which was very much collected was used, and was used as part of an impact assessment that perhaps come June 2020 people say, okay, right, that was a stormy 3 months. What have we learnt for children? What have we done to children? What harm are we doing to children? And what should we do to redress this? And I see very little evidence of that ever happening. And the evidence is that come the second lockdown at Christmas 20, the same thing was done. Even though we knew that children mercifully were spared from the harm that came from COVID, even my most sick patients, when they and their family got COVID, it was the parents who were unwell. These vulnerable children were remarkably unaffected. We knew that mental health was going up. We'd seen so many young people coming in with anorexia. We knew we were doing loads of harm, and yet we did exactly the same thing when the second wave came.
I wanted to ask you about the mental health impacts, because you say in your statement that although the college doesn't have strict involvement with CAMHS, it does play an advocacy role in relation to child and adolescent mental health services. And indeed, there was unprecedented demand on CAMHS. And you say, in turn, it resulted in an increase in children and young people presenting to emergency departments with complex psychosocial crises. And I think it was in December of 2021 that the Royal College, along with the Royal College of Emergency Medicine and the Royal College of Psychiatrists, put out a joint statement. And I'd just like to look at that statement. Can we have up on screen, please, INQ 620605? Thank you very much. And you can see there the background is setting out the enormous toll that the pandemic has taken on the mental health of children and young people across the country. You make the point there that it's struggling to keep up with demand. Obviously, there was a pre-existing mental health crisis for children. And if we go down, please, in the page to what your college and your fellow contributors to this statement are doing. So proactively engaging with NHS leaders working to improve systems. May I just ask you, are you able to give us a little bit of detail about what is there quite a bald or bland statement?
We were doing as best we can, providing data to senior decision makers across the 4 nations. Whether we were heard, I will.
All right.
Yeah, but the evidence is that we weren't.
Emphasising the importance of expanding paediatric liaison and CAMHS across the UK to achieve 24/7 access to support for children and young people, and improving access to appropriate inpatient provision. Can you provide a little detail or colour to that?
So if you look at adults have inpatient mental health facilities for adults who have acute mental health problems. Children don't. I live in Aberdeen. The nearest inpatient facility is in the central belt of Glasgow, 100 miles away. So there is no 24/7. There is very limited 24/7 response. So if a child with autism, for example, decompensates at home and the family are unable to cope with a violent, very agitated young person, they call an ambulance, the child's brought to the emergency department. Well, that's not right for the child. It's not right for the other children in the emergency department. But we just, as a society, have no consideration for what might happen out of hours with children's acute mental health.
And you call for mental health leadership across departments to be strengthened, the recruitment of staff able to bridge the gap between services, and accelerating the rollout of integrated models of care. Again, same question. Are you able to give us a little bit more detail about what the Royal College was doing in relation to that bullet point?
Well, what we were and what we continue to point out is that mental health problems are usually detectable many weeks and months before they happen. And if we can intervene, if we can identify and get involvement with the child and their family earlier on, many of these admissions can be avoided. We continue to push this message because the message still needs to be heard.
Now, you say in your statement that there has been some progress made in relation to supporting the mental health needs of children and young people, and you point to some work done by NHS England in 2022 when they published a framework setting out how children and young people with mental health needs in acute paediatric settings could be dealt with. And you say, though, the framework has been implemented differently in different areas. Is that necessarily a bad thing or a good thing?
Well, I guess if it's done because of local need, I think that's a very reasonable thing. I think if it's done differently because of local resources, that's not a good thing. It's a question of whether the service has been fitted around the child or whether the child is having to fit around the service.
I think you welcomed the news in 2023 that there would be a mental health champion in every provider that admits children. Yeah. Can you help expand on what the role of a mental health champion is or does?
Yeah, thanks. Now, this worked really well. So we recognised that there was a huge rise in children presenting with mental health conditions. Eating disorders, anorexia was the trigger. And we recognised that if we identified a clinician in each hospital who would take a lead for that, because as a paediatrician, I've never been trained in mental health, but it's sort of been forced upon me. And some of my colleagues have taken extra training. And if we identify people who are able to manage these complicated young people and their families, work with the community, work with mental health services, perhaps not surprisingly, things go a lot better. And so there were lots of paediatricians who saw this need and stepped forward, and it worked really well. But inevitably, once it was up and established, there were challenges to it. So funding was questioned, succession planning was questioned, and inevitably their inbox became a lot bigger with lots of other mental health problems coming through. So they did work really well, but they could work even better.
More generally, I think you say the college was vocal, use your words, on safeguarding issues during lockdown and was concerned that the needs of vulnerable children were not being met. And I think the college made clear the importance of safeguarding, in particular noting the role that schools play in identifying children who may be vulnerable or subject to neglect or abuse and the like. Does the RCPCH have a view on whether it was right to close the schools?
Again, initially, I think it made sense. But when you recognise that 30% of children in the UK, wherever you are living in poverty, and their school meal is the only good food they'll get all day, there are obvious problems there. You've talked about safeguarding. You're going to hear from my colleague from the Institute of Health Visiting later on. You know, there are bad things that happen behind doors within families. And when everybody's staying at home locked down and social workers aren't able to get into people's homes, those bad things aren't going to stop happening. And I would argue that if you've got everybody locked up in the same house, the things that trigger violence and abuse to children are probably going to be worse. So there were loads of concerns from the safeguarding perspective about closing schools and basically locking families away. And that's notwithstanding all of the educational, societal and all of the other impacts of shutting schools.
May I ask you about a different aspect of vulnerability in children, and in particular the college's involvement in advice on children who were in the shielding programme? Yeah. Can you help? And it's at paragraph 33 of your statement, Professor, but I think you say there that the college was pleased that the UK government adopted the college's advice on shielding for babies, children and young people, recommending that most, but not all, children and young people did not need to shield. Why was that welcome news from the college's perspective?
So again, when we started, we thought this could be really nasty, and there were three categories into which people of all ages were placed in terms of risk. But very, 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 very quickly, our patients and their parents told us that if, as I mentioned before, children who've gone through heroic surgery or have life-threatening problems are ventilated at night, when they get COVID and the rest of the family gets COVID, it's the parents and the carers who... So we knew very early on that they, for whatever reason, but weren't affected. Children who've had kidney transplants, whose immune system is suppressed, we were really worried about them, but the virus bounced off them. So we knew very, very quickly that this virus, for whatever reason, was not doing harm for the vast majority of children in whom we thought it would be. And it was also causing huge anxiety for their parents. You know, well, do I keep my child who's had the kidney transplant in a separate room to all of the other family? What do I do? So we knew that domestically this was causing a lot of friction. So when the changes were brought through on behalf of our parents and families, we thought this was great news, and it was really good that the government did listen. So going back to your very first question, that was perhaps one good thing that did happen during the pandemic. I got one.
I think, though, there was still nonetheless a small group of children that were deemed so clinically extremely vulnerable that they did have to continue to shield.
There was a very small number, and that was done on a case-by-case basis.
All right. You may maybe ask some further questions about clinically vulnerable children in a moment. May I just take a pause and a stand back, please, and just a final few reflections and indeed recommendations from you. And really this, if it's not already obvious, but the college's overriding message as set out in your statement is that pandemic planning cannot simply deal with people who become most unwell with the virus, which in this case was mostly adults, as the future generation, babies, children and young people, regardless of the direct impact on this group, must be prioritised. You will have heard me asking the Chief Nursing Officer about a number of potential pieces of evidence suggest that there wasn't the priority placed on children. The reasons for it may be difficult to ascertain, but can you help from the college's perspective why it was that there was this focus on adults primarily, and particularly not then focusing on the indirect harms to children and young people?
Yeah, I'm in danger of repeating myself. I think at the start it was very reasonable to do what was done. But we very quickly had knowledge, data, experience that children were not being directly affected by the virus, but were being hugely and in some cases irretrievably damaged by the indirect consequences of what we were doing to them. I think that the message I would be keen to get across is that there was, before the pandemic, during the pandemic and after the pandemic, there has not been equity. Children are not treated equally in our society. It is a defining characteristic against which we should not prejudice, but children do not get the best in this country. They're 25% of the population, they get 11% of the NHS spend. They rarely ever seem to feature in decision making. I think that senior decision makers acknowledge children, but they don't seem to get it. And the it is that, first of all, children don't undergo an epiphany when they reach adulthood. All of their health and illness issues they're not just taken away, they carry on. And the economic impact is vast. You know, the Nobel Prize was awarded in 2020 in 2000 to the guy who demonstrated that if you invest in children, the benefits to society are clear and evident. But that economic, that rights and that equality argument for looking after children just doesn't get recognised in any of the four nations in the UK. So going back to your question, why were children not prioritised? I think it goes back to that. I think that for whatever reason, people didn't think, I'm not going to say that people didn't think they were worth it, but people just didn't realise that the harm that they were doing, despite organisations, including ours, saying this is wrong, you cannot carry on doing this.
In your statement, the college sets out 12 recommendations for how to potentially prepare for a future pandemic. I'm not going to ask you about all 12, Professor, but one of the recommendations you make is that there is a comprehensive paediatric pandemic preparedness assessment that is undertaken, which will consider staffing, spaces, systems, equipment, ICU provision, and the like. What difference do you think that would make in the event of a future pandemic, assuming it's one that affects adults still primarily?
Yeah. So I think there's a number of different. So if there was a pandemic, had the COVID pandemic affected children equally as it had adults, thousands of children would likely have died because we just did not have the resource to provide intensive care on that scale. I think if another pandemic was like COVID and very much affected the elderly, I still think we need to preserve services. I think learning from what we have done, we need to recognise that the indirect harms of shutting down community services, shutting schools, many years down the line will be leaving ripples of discontent, poor development and harm. And I think if the next pandemic, because I think it's a matter of time, hopefully a long time, if that affects children more than adults, then I think we are in a real problem, because we do not have the workforce to look after children now. So if we had an expanded population of ill children with this, with a virus, I think we would be in a very, very difficult place, been having to make some very, very difficult decisions. And I understand that, to continue with the alliteration, it's Project Pegasus that's been looking at that has been looking at that today. But I think we can plan, but the planning that takes place on a whole population basis needs to have, right at its heart, don't forget the children.
Right. Which brings me to my final topic for you, and it's your recommendation at paragraph 49.3. And you recommend on behalf of the college that regular children's rights impact assessments should be carried out and published to accompany all policy decisions or legislation changes which impact them. Can you help us, please? What benefits do you think such an approach would have on children's health in the UK were there children's rights impact assessments as you set out in your statement?
Yeah, I think it would help people think child. I think it would remind people not to forget children. Children do have rights, and these need to be considered in amongst the rights of the rest of the population. So I think that they would very much help people in senior decision-making places to think child.
Maybe a good place to stop. Professor, they're all my questions, but there are some questions from Mr. Wagner, King's Counsel, on behalf of the clinically vulnerable's families. And he's just over there. Just pause one moment while we
no
turn
worries.
to him.
Thank you, Ms. Carey. Mr. Wagner.
Good afternoon. As Ms Carey said, I represent clinically vulnerable families, which is a group that, as you can probably guess, represents the interests of clinically vulnerable, clinically extremely vulnerable and immunocompromised children and families. I just want to ask you first about the guidance or advice that you published in June 2020 that you were taken to by, or you were asked about by Ms Carey, and then that was adopted by the Department of Health in July 2020. The guidance said, one of the things it said was that the majority of children with asthma, diabetes, epilepsy and kidney disease do not need to continue to shield and could, for example, return to school as they schools as they reopened. You're aware of the guidance, and you don't need to go to it. Did you appreciate that children with asthma, diabetes, epilepsy, and kidney disease were not actually shielded at that time? Had not been told to shield.
I understood that they had been told to shield, which is why the guidelines said that they did not need to shield.
Yeah, but they weren't told formally to shield in the way that adults were. And on reflection, would you accept the guidance in that respect was a bit muddled?
So I do a lot of asthma clinics, and my parents were telling me that they were shielding their children. I think that the message you should shield if you've got asthma had got out there, and it might well have been a bit muddled if the initial message was just for adults with asthma to shield. But certainly my experience is that children with asthma were being shielded with some difficulty, and they were delighted that they were no longer told. They were told they no longer needed to shield.
But you accept that may have been coming from individual decisions taken by parents rather than formal government advice?
Yes, so no, I stand corrected. I understood that the original advice that was given to children with asthma, diabetes, epilepsy, was to shield because at that time we thought that they might be vulnerable. But I was pleased that in the summer of 2020 that it was clarified that they did not need to shield. So I think that did clarify the situation.
No, I appreciate that, listening to your evidence that your focus was on, correct me if I'm wrong, it was on encouraging children who didn't have a higher risk and parents who may have thought their children had a higher risk to return to school because it was better for them to be at school than not to be at school. Do you accept that there were nonetheless children with certain conditions such as chronic kidney disease and diabetes who had higher risks from COVID-19 than the general population?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch your question.
So do you accept that there were certain conditions such as chronic kidney disease and diabetes?
Sorry, right. I accept that there were some children who might be more vulnerable than others. My personal experience is that there were vanishingly few of them. But no, and that's why I think the guidance was that there might be some children who do need to shield, and that is very much on a case-by-case basis. So I do accept that there might have been some, and there certainly were some.
Yeah. And do you also accept that at that time, in June, July 2020, schools were, in terms of COVID transmission, still risky environments, particularly because of crowded classrooms, poor ventilation, prolonged indoor contact, and the lack of masking?
I think a lot of schools demonstrated some social distancing. I think some schools insisted children wore masks beyond the summer of 2020. But I do accept the premise that if you put people together, infections do spread. What I don't accept is that for a healthy child, getting COVID put them at considerable risk, that meant from the child's perspective that they shouldn't go to school.
But for the child who had that additional risk, even if it was just a bit more risk, and that's my client's perspective is from that perspective.
Sure.
Do you accept that for some parents, even knowing how important in-person schooling is and all of the factors you rightly pointed out, it would have still been reasonable for them making that individual risk analysis to decide that in-person schooling was not the correct option for their children because they didn't want to put them to that additional risk?
I think that for the vast majority of children with the conditions that we talked about, diabetes, asthma, there was the individual child was at no increased risk, of no meaningful increased risk for coming to any harm from COVID, and it was very much in their benefit that they got back to school.
Yep. And just finally, do you think, looking back, that the college's guidance properly reflected that there were some children for whom the risk would have been higher and the decision-making, the factors may have been just a bit different for them?
I can't remember the exact words of the college guidance, but I think the spirit of the college guidance was exactly right, that the vast majority of children who were initially thought to have some increased risk didn't actually have that risk. But I also accept that there were some children who were potentially at risk, but that number was tiny.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Wagner. That completes the questions that we have for you, Professor Turner. Thank you very much for the help that you've given to the inquiry. I don't know if any colleagues assisted you, but thank you for what you've done, and if they did, thank you to them as well. Thank you for helping us.
Thank you, my lady.
You're very welcome.
Very well, I shall return for this afternoon's session at 1:45.
Thank you very much.